first of all, I'm going to commend all of you on two things. We only reopened yesterday, and this is our first event of what I think of as the season, because I still think in academic years after all this time. And so we have a full house, which is fantastic. And you got to your seats faster than any group has ever done that. So I'm very impressed. But mostly I'm impressed that you're all here for what is a topic that we talk about in this building a lot. So I'm very eager to turn the microphone over to Dr. Mary Grabar. But before I do that, I want to thank the National Italian American Foundation, because they really made tonight possible for us. And it's a collaboration with Columbus Heritage Coalition. And I see several Heritage Coalition members, including Angelo Vivolo, our board member, former chair, and chair of Columbus Heritage Coalition. So it's also nice to collaborate with friends and colleagues, and I really can't wait to turn the microphone over to you. So I'm going to get out of the way, and on we go. Okay.
Well, thank you for having me. Because I misinterpreted an email message, I thought I was going to be here for 15 minutes and making some casual remarks before your speaker came up. And then I found out yesterday I am the speaker. And I think I have 40 minutes, but I usually have no problem filling time. I taught college for 20 years, and so actually, you know, I'm used to the sound of backpacks zipping up, people ready to leave. And I won't be offended. I know you don't have any backpacks, but if there's someone here who could like give me a signal like 5 minutes or something, because I tend to go on, and certainly with Howard Zinn, there is so much to say. You know, I keep coming up with new material, and especially about what he has done to Christopher Columbus, a great hero. I don't know if all of you know who Howard Zinn actually was. He was a historian. He had a PhD in history from Columbia University. He was born in 1922 and he died in 2010. And just recently on August 24th, there was the 100th year anniversary celebration of his birthday. And I attended that online, and I learned that his books just keep on selling. When I wrote this book, and I think they did a great job with the cover, don't you think so? The red actual image of him, red for more than one reason, as we'll find out if you don't know. When I wrote that, it came out in 2019, I estimated that his book had sold People's History of the United States, which came out in 1980 originally. It's been through numerous editions, many, many printings. In 2019, I had estimated that it had sold 3 million copies. Already that was phenomenal for a book of its type. It's, you know, my hairdresser read this. He was convinced by it. I gave him my book. As far as our discussions go, I don't think he's changed his mind, but there are some we get through to. But I learned a couple of weeks ago that there are now 4 million copies that have been sold. People just keep buying it. It remains a bestseller for Amazon. It's a phenomenon. It sells more copies each year than the year before. That just doesn't happen. I mean, I would be very happy if my books, you know, you sold more each year as we went on. Usually it tapers off, you know, you get the big push. But anyway, Howard Zinn was a historian. He taught at Spelman College and at Boston University. But he was a rock star historian. He was beloved by, you know, rock stars. Bruce Springsteen was his friend. Pearl Jam devoted a song to him. Jane Fonda mourned his death and wrote a tribute to him. And so he achieved the kind of reputation that so many academics and historians wish they'd achieved, at least to reach that many people. I don't know if we'd want to be known for what he was known for. But anyway, so that's just a very short biography of him. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, of course, focus on Christopher Columbus and what he has done to Christopher Columbus, the reputation of him, especially among many young people. I'm going to go through my pages. I'm going to skip sections, and I'm going to, go off on a tangent occasionally. So this is what I do, and so I begin chapter 1. Howard Zinn rode to fame and fortune on the untold story of Christopher Columbus, a shocking tale of severed hands, raped women, and gentle enslaved people who worked to death to shake the white Europeans' lust for gold. Today, that story is anything but untold. Zinn's narrative about the genocidal discoverer of America has captured our education system and popular culture. Consider what Columbus Day had become by the fall of 2017, when the violent Marxist-inspired group Antifa declared a nationwide Deface Columbus Day. The defacement of statues of Columbus with red paint had already become an annual ritual in many places. In Pittsburgh, it had been going on for 20 years. In New York City, the large bronze statue in Columbus Circle, at the corner of Central Park, it had "Hate will not be tolerated" scrawled on the base, and Columbus's hands painted red. Near where I live in Utica, New York, the statue is defaced. It's a common story. And to bring us up to date during that so-called summer of love of 2020, or the 1619 Project riots, if you remember that, there were, among all that frenzy of attacks on symbols of America's history, there were 30 on Christopher Columbus. And I continue, and the transformation in Americans' attitudes toward the man who discovered America wasn't limited to a few vandals. Besides the physical attacks, there were continual demands for the government to take down the statue. Zinn is the inspiration behind the current campaign to abolish Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. High school teachers cite his book in making the case for renaming to their local communities. The Zinn Education Project is a nonprofit started by one of his students. They have a campaign for the classroom called Abolish Columbus Day. They send out free teacher kits to teachers of third graders who have them write letters to local officials to abolish Columbus. And what they learn about Columbus is based on Zinn. Back in 2018 in San Francisco, Cincinnati, and Rochester, New York, and 60 other cities had come together. They'd replaced Columbus Day with the Indigenous Peoples Day. 6 states, as of that writing, do not recognize the holiday as Columbus Day. In 2018, for the first time, Columbus, Ohio, did not observe the federal holiday, with officials claiming that the city could not afford to give its employees the day off. Many articles reporting on this trend cited Howard Zinn's role in the change in attitude. Courthouse News Service, describing the overwhelming support in San Francisco for changing the holiday with a board vote of 10-1, explains social activist and historian Howard Zinn dedicated the first chapter of his 1980 book, A People's History of the United States, challenging the popular narrative of Christopher Columbus as a stoic hero who overcame adversity to become the first Western explorer to find the New World. The news report claimed that Zinn had cited evidence that Columbus enslaved and killed the gentle native people he encountered in the Caribbean islands, leading to the mass murder and taking of land from natives across the continent. The sponsor of the bill, San Francisco Supervisor Malia Cohen, had written in a Facebook post, "The indisputably horrific things that Christopher Columbus did to the established inhabitants of the Americas with whom he came in contact are #facts." And since then, I've come across a couple officials who chose Howard Zinn's book instead of the Bible to take their oaths of office. Yes, that is true. There was a city council member and a district attorney. That ought to scare people. In Columbus, on Columbus Day in 2018, in a man on the street interview at the Columbus Fountain near Union Station in Washington, D.C., a man who looked to be in his 30s explained in reply to a reporter's question about celebrating the holiday that guy, Columbus, killed a lot of Native Americans. He cited Zinn's history. And I bet you if you went down on the street and asked people, especially younger people, they would say the same thing. Zinn's work has affected the teaching of history, even in cases where his own materials are not used. According to Professor James Green, who noted in 2003 that nearly every college textbook published during the last 2 decades now begins as Zinn did with the European destruction of the Indians. Zinn was quite proud of that accomplishment. He lived to see the day when, on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first landing in the New World, Americans were bitterly divided over whether Columbus Day should be a day of celebration or mourning, of pride or shame. That was, as he wrote in his autobiography, one of his greatest accomplishments. He was very proud of that fact. And of course, that the recognition of Columbus has changed drastically the identity of this country. Even before the founding is identified with Columbus. During the War for Independence, America distanced herself from Britannia by calling herself Columbia. Columbus's discovery was celebrated in 1792. King's College became Columbia University. The new capital was the District of Columbia. Washington Irving, in 1828, the famous writer, wrote the best-selling multi-volume history of Christopher Columbus and of the discovery. The 400th anniversary, 1892, there were parades, civic gatherings, speeches, church services, and a proclamation by President Benjamin Harrison. And he said, to observe Columbus Day. He called him the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. In 1893, we had the world's largest fair to date, the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. And around 1892 was also a time of vast discrimination against Italian Americans. That's when there was the largest mass lynching in this country of 11 Italian men. There was overt discrimination. There have been signs put up at employment places, Irish need not apply. The same was true for Italians. Zinn's warped version of Columbus, this new version, and the discovery of America was intended to reverberate into American political life as the 1995 edition's new chapter, The Unreported Resistance, which dealt with protests against military efforts in Central America and Iraq, showed. 3.5 pages were devoted to Native Americans who connected these conquests with the original one by Columbus. So everything's going back to Columbus, allegedly. And they protested against the quincentennial celebration of discovery of America. The Education Project put out a book called Rethinking Columbus. It sold 200,000 copies in a few months. There were protests against Columbus on the 500th anniversary, where there should have been widespread uniform celebrations. In that 1995 edition, Zinn wrote, he exulted, for generations, exactly the same story had been told all American school children about Columbus, a romantic admiring story. Now thousands of teachers around the country were beginning to tell that story differently. He was proud of that. So what exactly was Zinn's new and different story about Columbus, and where did it come from? In a 1998 interview with his admirer, David Barsamian, when David asked him, in the course of your investigations and writing a people's history, what facts came out that were startling to you? Zinn answered, I suppose just as the readers of my people's history were startled by my story of Columbus, I was startled myself. I must confess that until I began looking into it, I did not know any more about Columbus than I had learned in school. By this time, I had a PhD in American history. Nothing that I learned on any level of education from elementary school through Columbia University changed the story of the heroic Columbus and his wonderful accomplishments. It wasn't until I began to look into it myself, read Columbus's journals, read Bartolome de las Casas, the great eyewitness who produced many volumes on what happened to the Indians. Not until I began to read did I suddenly realize with a kind of shock how ignorant I had been led to be by the education I had gotten in our national education system. Presumably extrapolating from the many volumes he had read, Zinn found the inspiration for the dramatic opening sentences of a people's history. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. The quoted passage from Columbus's log continues with Columbus's description of the Arawaks. He describes them as well-built and handsomely featured. Having never seen iron, they accidentally cut themselves on the European swords when they touched them. The passage ends with Columbus's famous, now infamous words. They have no iron. Their spears are made out of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And this was a passage that was read during an episode of The Sopranos, where the teenage son, AJ, is doing his homework in the morning and his father gets upset and he says, and AJ says, well, my teacher told me this is true. And this guy named Howard Zinn said it was true. There are ellipses in this passage, those 3 or 4 dots that everyone learns about in English class. You put those in when you're quoting and you don't have room for the entire quote, but it's not supposed to change the meaning, right? And so, of course, I'm writing this and I say the ellipses in this passage are Zinn's, not mine. And as we shall see, those omissions are essential to Zinn's dishonest retelling of the Columbus story. By leaving crucial words out of the quotation, Zinn makes Columbus say something very different from what he actually said. Zinn began and finished a people's history of the United States in less than a year after he returned from a 4-month professorship in Paris in 1978. This fact, quote, surprises people and sometimes makes them think I obviously did it in a hurry and didn't spend much time on it, he explained. But he claimed I'd been accumulating the notes and material, the data for 20 years as a result of teaching and writing about history. Once he sat down at his typewriter, he claims it came very fast. But there is no evidence that Zinn ever actually made extensive notes in preparation for writing a people's history. On the contrary, there is telling proof that he did no such thing. It's unlikely that he even read as much of Columbus's journals or the works of Las Casas, the great eyewitness, as he claimed. The truth is that Zinn's description of Columbus's first encounter with the American Indians is lifted from a little book, a little over 100 pages long. It's called Columbus, His Enterprise, Exploding the Myth. This book was written for high school students, and it was written by a fellow anti-Vietnam War activist by the name of Hans Koning, and it was published in 1976. So a short little book, it's got pictures in it too. The great historian, Howard Zinn. Koning's book is the source for Zinn's indictment of Columbus, which is the opening gambit of a people's history. And I discovered this, I live in Clinton, New York, a very small town, and I'm at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. I think it was January something. It's a cold night, and I'm reading this. And I'm reading Koning's book. I had, of course, made myself go through Zinn's book. And it's like, I think I've read this before. It's the kind of feeling I got when I was teaching. Those of you who taught, right? This doesn't sound like the students writing. I think I've seen this someplace else. Now we can do a Google search, right? And we know what happens to students, right? In most places where I taught, first time they got a failing grade for the paper. Second time, it probably went on their official record, and there was a danger of expulsion. But Howard Zinn is credited with discovering this. So I've got about 5 passages that I lay side by side. And what Zinn did is, he plagiarized, and, first day of class, I taught English. It's like, yeah, this is plagiarism, a long statement on the syllabus. Don't do this, right? Plagiarism is when you don't include quotes, when you just shift things around a little bit, exchange a few words. And that's exactly what Howard Zinn did. I couldn't believe it. So I laid it side by side. And there's actually a book now published by the University of Georgia Press, by a professor, 4 teachers, instructing them how to use Howard Zinn's book. And I communicated with this guy, and I said, this guy plagiarized. I never heard back from him. Then his book came out, and he says, there is no evidence of plagiarism. I got the proof. Koning's slim volume does not cite any sources. Koning was not a Columbus scholar any more than Zinn was. In fact, he was not even a historian, while Zinn was at least a college professor. But what the two men shared was an interesting history in politics. Koning had been a member of the Dutch resistance under his original name, Hans Koningsberger, which he changed in 1970. He was a socialist and a founder, along with Noam Chomsky and Zinn, of the anti-Vietnam War Resist organization. The obituary for Koning, who died in 2007 in The Guardian, described him as a novelist, a playwright, and a journalist who had traveled to Russia and China in the 1960s. And his little book is fiction. And Zinn copied from it. The polemics of Columbus, his enterprise, are crude. It was widely panned. This is a phrase, the grade school image of Columbus is not naive, it is false, he said. He says, far from being the dashing adventurer, the fearless knight with blazing blue eyes, Columbus was probably short, uneducated, intellectually unsophisticated, poor at navigation, and a thief of others' ideas. Sounds like he's got a grudge or something. Koning's book was panned by commentators and historians who took note of the change in tenor as the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America approached. On the day before Columbus Day in 1992, Harvey Morris called Koning a historical reductionist, someone who refuses to accept any nuances in the character or context of Columbus's life, instead resorting to the cliche of comparing him to Hitler and the Nazis. In the December 21, 1991 Economist, Professor Felipe Fernandez Armesto, a specialist in Latin American history and author of a book on Columbus, published by Oxford University Press that came out at that time, claimed that the most damaging of the currently fashionable myths, damaging to the truth and damaging to race relations, is that Latin America was created by a crime of genocide initiated by Columbus. He called it a particularly wicked lie because it makes real examples of genocide seem commonplace and unshocking. So Zinn based his famous opening pages on a controversial book written for high school students. And while Koning's work was treated dismissively, Zinn's transcriptions of Koning's material to his own book are taken as groundbreaking historical revelations. And that's a unique aspect of his book. And it's been noted by others. People believe it, especially the young and the naive. It's like, this has to be true. And he's very good with words. I have to give that to him. And few know that they are little more than transcriptions. Zinn perpetuates Koning's smears and Koning's telling, and in Zinn's, Columbus set out to enslave a uniformly gentle people for the sole purpose of enriching himself with gold. In fact, that is far from the truth. As you probably know, European efforts to find a sea route to Asia had been going on for hundreds of years. Columbus's voyages of discovery were a continuation of Europeans' ventures of sailing to Asia, first around Africa, that had begun in 1291. Spain had one particularly pressing reason. Columbus sought the Eastern or Far Eastern alliances to end a millennium of Islam's jihad-imposed tyranny against Christendom. When the Spanish Christian monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella recaptured Grenada on January 2nd, 1492, they ended almost 8 centuries of jihad ravages, massacres, pillage, mass enslavement, and deportation under Muslim rule. Thus, Columbus's mission was multifaceted and inspired by several motivations: to reach the East Indies and to effect an alliance with someone he thought would be there called the Grand Khan, the Great Khan, excuse me. Carol Delaney has written a book that describes, his motivations. This was to find the New Jerusalem, and this person was to be believed to be the sovereign of all that region and favorable to the Christian religion, and finally to diffuse Christianity throughout that unknown continent and trade with the traditional sources of gold and spices. But when he encountered naked natives instead of the Asian merchants he was expecting, Columbus did not jump to thoughts of working them to death for gold, as Zinn, following Koning, suggests. Koning introduces passages by leading sentences and then quotes out of context carefully selected passages from Columbus's log, which Zinn then quotes even more selectively, leaving out passages that flatly contradict the Columbus as greedy for gold committer of genocide. For example, in his log entry for October 12th, 1492, Columbus wrote, "I warned my men to take nothing from the people without giving something in exchange." You're not going to find that in Zinn or Koning. But Zinn's most crucial omissions are in the passage from Columbus's log that he quotes in the very first paragraph. There he uses ellipses to cover up the fact that he has left out enough of Columbus's words to deceive his readers about what the discoverer of America actually meant. The omission, right before they would make fine servants, which AJ reads, right, is particularly dishonest. And again, that passage is, they have no iron, their spears are made out of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all, make them do whatever we want. Here's the nub of what Zinn left out. This is what he wrote. I saw some who bore marks of wounds on their bodies, and I made signs to them to ask how this came about. And they indicated to me that people came from other islands which are near and wished to capture them, and they defended themselves. And I believed and still believe that they come here from the mainland to take them for slaves. So there is a hostile tribe, and they've got scars from their battles. There's a tribe called the Caribs that are trying to capture them. So the natives are not all uniformly gentle people, as Zinn pretends. And then I go into various people who've translated Columbus's journals. Robert Poussin is a well-known one. He said, that actually when what Columbus was referring to when he said they would make fine servants was what the Caribs, the hostile tribe, was thinking of. But Zinn makes it appear that that's what Columbus is thinking with those ellipses. And what I point out is that those ellipses between the two phrases, they would make fine servants, the ellipses, and then with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Those ellipses indicate 2 days worth of passages. Pages, okay? Fail, 0 for this paper. But people believe it. People like AJ, a teenager in school, they believe it. This is the truth. Okay, so Zinn's selective quotations are designed to give the impression that Columbus had no concern for the Indians' spiritual or physical well-being, that the explorer was motivated only by a frenzy for money that drove him to enslave the natives for profit when he wasn't hunting them down with dogs because they couldn't supply him with large quantities of gold from supposed mines, whose very existence was part fiction created by Columbus himself. But literally, the explorer's first concern, the hope that he expressed in the initial comment about the natives, was for the Indians' freedom and their eternal salvation. And this is a quote from him. I want the natives to develop a friendly attitude toward us because I know that they are a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force. That's from the 2 pages of excised material. Zinn just entirely omits the passage in which Columbus expresses his respect and concern for the Indians. And students will not learn from Howard Zinn about how Columbus tried to protect the Taínos from the Caribs, or that he did not own any slaves personally, or that when the Caribs were enslaved, now these were a hostile tribe, they were said to be cannibals. It was a common practice at the time for prisoners of war that they were enslaved as prisoners of war. That was actually seen as an improvement because before then, prisoners of war were just killed. So, but that was a new convention in warfare, and it was seen as morally advanced, and he wanted to give them a chance to convert. Columbus never did any of those things Zinn said he did. He gave instructions to his men to treat them with kindness and fairness. He brought back 6 after the first of his 4 trips. He had them baptized and adopted one as his godson. His intent was to save their souls and make them free by conversion to the faith. On the second voyage, with 17 ships, they discovered Guadalupe and the Caribs who lived there. The Caribs were the enslavers. The Caribs persecuted the Tainos, raping the women, castrating the boys, and cannibalizing the men. Columbus rescued as many of the Tainos as he could and brought them to their home. When they came back after the trip, one of the ships had run aground, and so they had to leave 39 men back there, and they were all killed. But the men accompanying Columbus refused to work. When some returned to Spain with 26 of the Caribs, Columbus asked that these Caribs be treated better than other slaves and be instructed in the faith. There was abuse, but it was not by Columbus, it was by some of the men. But Columbus is blamed for it by Howard Zinn. When Columbus returned to Spain in 1496 after the second voyage with 200 of the Christians and 30 natives, he was dressed in a brown monk's habit, perhaps in penance for how the Spanish had treated the natives. He set sail again for the third time in 1498. He discovered that in his absence, a man named Roldan and his men had gone on rampages. He ordered that 2 of the men be hanged for their abuse of the natives. Francisco de Bobadilla, who had been sent by the king and queen to check on the settlement in La Isabela, became enraged. When Columbus arrived after exploring the islands, he was put in chains, but sent by Bobadilla and sent back to Spain. Now, both Koning and Zinn mock Columbus for that, because he was unjustly put in chains, for protecting the natives. Queen Isabella ordered the removal of the chains, but sent Nicholas Ovando with 35 ships and appointed him governor, thus stripping Columbus of his title. On Columbus's 4th and last trip with his 12-year-old son, he warned Bobadilla and his men of a hurricane, and you may have heard this story, but he ignored him, and Bobadilla went down in a storm. When Columbus reached land, he heard about the atrocities committed by Ovando, including the murder of 85 native chiefs. Columbus and his men were marooned on Jamaica for 1.5 years, but were rescued in 1504. Columbus learned that Isabella had died in his absence, so he was unable to tell her what had happened, and King Ferdinand was not as much of an advocate for him as the Queen was, and he reneged on all the privileges that Isabella had bestowed on Columbus. Columbus died 2 years later at the age of 56. He left his money to fund 4 missionaries to the natives. Quite the opposite picture. So that is the true story of Columbus. Why would a historian not tell the story? Why would he lie? Well, we have to know who Howard Zinn is, and I think a lot of you already know who he was. Zinn grew up in the 1930s in Brooklyn. His parents never achieved the American dream as they thought. They were Russian Jewish immigrants. Zinn was very bitter because he had to work it with his father as a caddy and a caterer. Hey, as immigrants, I'm an immigrant. I know, you take any job you can get. So he was lured in by the communists as a teenager in the 1930s. And he went to this, what he called a peaceful protest in front of Times Square. And they were just peaceful, but the policemen started knocking them on their heads with the batons. And he woke up, he came to in a doorway, and he thought to himself, and this is what he writes in his autobiography, which is taught to school children, those young communists on the block were right. The state and its police were on the side of the rich and powerful. From that day, he was a believer in Marxism. He worked at a shipyard, served in World War II, and then got his PhD on the GI Bill. In 1956, he landed a job at Spelman College in Atlanta, a small Christian college for Black women. He did not adhere to his job description. He radicalized the students, turned them against the administration, and was fired for insubordination in 1963 by the college's first Black and first male president. Wish we could have that today. Some professors fired for insubordination. And there's a long saga about how Zinn, and I have it in my book, about how he fought with him. He compared this first Black president to a plantation overseer. It's really bizarre. But nonetheless, he soon landed on his feet and was at Boston University, where he radicalized the students there, led them on anti-Vietnam War protests, rooting for Ho Chi Minh. Zinn went to Hanoi with Father Berrigan to bring back American prisoners of war. He was a celebrity. If you read the newspapers from the 1960s and 1970s, Zinn makes headlines. And then he was asked to write a history book. And so his book came out in 1980, and we know how he bragged about all the research that he did and the reading he did in the dusty library. No such thing. He had no time to read anything. So the reason why he would lie is because this book basically follows Frederick Engel's 1847 speech called The Discovery of America, which claimed that Columbus's discovery led to the struggle of propertyless against the property owners. Engels charged that Columbus began the path of destruction in this Garden of Eden that was occupied by gentle native people who never committed any crimes, no violence, no war. It was perfectly peaceful, and then it was ruined by that greedy capitalist, Columbus. That is the standard Communist Party line. It was repeated by Communist Party Chairman William Z. Foster in his 1951 book called Outline Political History of the Americas, which I forgot to bring it with me, but I'm a book hoarder. I think they say it's not hoarding if it's books, but I'll go to these used bookstores. And I was like reading through it, and I'm like reading through Howard Zinn. It's like, wow, there are a lot of parallels here. Same interpretation. Well, in 1951, Howard Zinn, while he was still a graduate student, was teaching Marxism at the Communist Party headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. And Howard Zinn was a member of the Communist Party from about 1948 to 1953. His FBI files say that. I rely on the authority of Ron Radish, a historian who also was briefly a member of the party. He compared Zinn's file, 500 pages, to his own. He said he was a communist. And like many communists of the 1950s, he obeyed party orders to drop official membership and go into the institutions. And he was very successful at that. And Zinn tapped into the zeitgeist of the 1960s. This was the perfect opportunity for him. So he transformed, if you read communist stuff, it's just so dreadfully boring. My colleague Harvey Clare, a great political scientist at Emory University, retired. He said he was glad he just didn't have to read that stuff. But Zinn knew how to turn it in, use lingo like the establishment with a capital E, the system with a capital S in his book. So he twisted it around. And so what we basically have is communist propaganda. And it makes what was said about Columbus and what Columbus said himself to be the opposite. And Zinn did this with other issues about the Vietnam War, about the Civil War, about slavery, and he does this throughout. But I'll just end with this. Zinn also, yes, did quote Bartolome de las Casas. But as you can imagine, that was twisted around, and it's in my book. But there's one passage that he did not quote, and I point out in my book. This is what Las Casas said about Columbus. Now, this was the crusading priest who had this conversion experience. He was originally a plantation owner, had slaves, and he was influenced by a sermon and said, we should not enslave the natives. For a while, he thought that Africans could be enslaved, but even, towards the end of his life, he's changed his mind on that. But what he wrote was intended to be inspirational to end slavery. And he exaggerated the abuses, but he wanted to end slavery. He thought it was evil. But he was not talking about Columbus. He was talking about the men who came after him, quite frankly, because he came mostly after Columbus died. So this is what he writes about Columbus. Many is the time I have wished that God would again inspire me, and that I had Cicero's gift of eloquence to extol the indescribable service to God and to the whole world, which Christopher Columbus rendered at the cost of such pain and dangers, such skill and expertise, when he so courageously discovered the New World. And I think that's what students need to learn.
Here for hours and hours and hours, because I could certainly listen to you talk more. I think one of the fascinating things about your book, about your talk, and about the way I think about Columbus in the almost exactly to the day 3 years since I've been here as executive director, is that history is so nuanced. You can't teach nuance as they're wrapping the noose around the sculpture's neck and pulling it down. But I guess I find it fascinating that Zinn has this kind of hold on, society in this way, because as we all know, if you've been in the academic world, I mean, you're lucky if you sell 300 copies of an academic book. I wrote a book about Alfred Treadway White and the public housing push of the 19th century in Brooklyn, and I bet nobody here has ever heard of that book. And my mother didn't even read that book. So, I mean, the fact that an academic could have, somehow, reach such celebrity status that this book is still selling fascinates me. But, also coming out of the cultural heritage world, I mean, I was taught to want to interpret the many layers of history and let conflicting thoughts coexist. And so how we've gotten to a point where, it's go to the barricades for Columbus or take the Columbus statues down and absolutely nothing in between is troubling to me. I don't understand why we don't want to have an interpretation of Columbus that says, we don't really know whether he was a nice person or not, but he did something extraordinary. And no matter how we feel about perhaps our lack of understanding of Native American culture or what the exact encounters were like, I mean, he did something that none of us would do. We would not get into a little wooden boat, sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and do it multiple times. And so, I mean, he did something extraordinary. And I think the other thing that I always come back to, and I was thinking it while you were talking, is, no matter how we want to interpret history, all of the things that we are laying at Columbus's feet, the ill effects to the native communities that Europeans arrived here, slavery, diseases, all of these things were inevitable. He was not the only explorer. Somebody would have gotten here. And more to the point, I mean, Spanish colonial rule endured 400 years in the Americas. I mean, Columbus may or may not have been a nice person, but the ill effects as we might interpret them today, really aren't Columbus. I mean, there are hundreds of years of things that happened after Columbus, and I don't really understand why we want to lay all of this at Columbus's feet. And I guess that's the other thing I don't quite understand about the hold Howard Zinn has, on this topic in this way, that why aren't people, in addition to you, saying this is an illogical way to interpret history? He was one man who did an extraordinary thing, but then decades and centuries of encounters happened afterwards. So it's an odd thing that Columbus has become the flashpoint for this, in my mind. So I'm going to turn it over to other people who I'm sure you are free to respond to my nonsense, but also I'm sure there's questions from the audience.
No, I mean, I think, once you study history, Bernard Bailyn is a historian that Zinn trashes. And he does something very different that historians don't do. He says he makes this appeal, and it's his style, his propagandistic style is very sophisticated. He was able to capture the confidence of people, especially young people. And so, great historians like Gordon Wood, Bernard Bailyn, who was Gordon Wood's mentor, these giants of history are trashed by Zinn by his claims that they uphold imperialism and murder and so forth. And he knocks them down. But and then the other thing he does is he asks these questions, a series of questions. And so the reader who, doesn't look at this and say, what are you doing here? Someone who's young says, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. And then he emotionally engages, he uses emotional appeals. And the other thing is that readers read this and they feel like they don't need to read any other book, because he says, I'm giving you the whole story. What other people are telling you, the patriotic story, the good story, is wrong. I've uncovered this. We know he hasn't uncovered this. I mean, this goes back to the 19th century. And the reason to attack Columbus is, the reason why our great heroes are being attacked, like in the summer of 2020. I mean, these standards that are placed on people of the past, they have to be saints. No one is a saint, right? But the reason you attack Columbus is you attack the very legitimacy of this country. Zinn comes out and says, this country is not real. I forget the word that he uses. He says it's illegitimate. We have no reason to be here. It's a pretense. I think he uses that word. And so where do you start to get to that place? You start with the person who discovered America. So the whole program right from the beginning is he claims is based on murder, exploitation, enslavement. So the whole, we need to start over. And that's his objective. Because as he goes through page by page, the reader will say, wow, this didn't work. The Constitution is corrupt. Oh, the Equal Voting Rights Act won't have any impact. Oh, women's suffrage, they're still slaves. He compares women to slaves. This is really insulting. None of this is just because we still have an unequal distribution of property, of wealth. And the founders were hypocrites. And so you have to start with Columbus. And I was talking about Bernard Bailyn. He's got the He's got a book about the barbaric age, and he talks about what life was like in pre-Columbian America among the native tribes. I mean, it was universal warfare. Enslavement was universal. But in terms of what Christopher Columbus did and what the West did, if you compare it side by side, you know, there is kindness there. There was concern for people's souls. He could not have shown love for other people more as a devout Christian than by attempting to save them through conversion to his faith. Any questions? Yeah.
Could you address the issue of this treatment of the Spanish versus Columbus? He separated the two. It doesn't seem like the culpability extended in the same way it was placed on Columbus.
Yeah, it's just Columbus. He actually blames Columbus for things, you know, that the Spanish did. And even though, you know, he punished the men, that's not acknowledged. So, you know, I think it was Saul Alinsky said, freeze your target, right? You have to have a person. I don't think it's, if you want to write propaganda, anti-American, anti-Columbus propaganda, you need to focus on that one person. Because I remember growing up in Rochester, New York, in the 1960s elementary school, Columbus was a hero. It was something to be proud of, you know, and I was an immigrant. My parents, you know, spoke Slovenian at home. You know, I was 2 years old when we came here. And it was a way for me to become Americanized. And, you know, we learned about the 3 ships, and this was a brave man. He had courage, you know, and I knew my parents were glad to be here because they'd left a communist country. So, you know, this, and so the attacks on Columbus are attacks on this country. You know, I mean, that's it. This is a communist. And I, you know, you have to say it. You know, he wasn't just a leftist. He knew how to present communist propaganda in 1960s style. He was great at doing that. And so this is very readable. It's exciting. It's emotionally engaging. If you read William Z. Foster, it's as boring as, you know, anything is, like, you know, or Marx's Das Kapital. Who wants to read that? People want to read Howard Zinn. Yeah.
Thank you. I read the book. I thought it was excellent.
Thank you.
And I think the thing that was most amazing in the book is the fact of how it became so ingrained, not only in academia, Hollywood culture, your comment about the dialogue in Good Will Hunting.
Right.
Brought it home because this is so much bigger than the one book. It's throughout the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And you bringing that out is just mind-boggling. I've told many people, I mean, you have to understand what's going on today by reading your book, because it shows that there's a whole generation that this is their bedrock truth about what they learned about history.
Yeah, and what surprised me when I set out to write this, you know, I kind of got wind of Zinn around 2008, and I started writing articles about him in 2010. I presented this report at this organization called America's Survival, and I could see that he was, you know, very anti-American. But once I started digging into his sources and comparing him to, you know, people he was referencing in a very vague way. Of course, he doesn't use footnotes because, you know, that would be too easy to track him down. And I thought, okay, And one of the things I point out, the American Historical Association, the professional organization for historians, has their rules. And I compare what has happened to other historians, what's her name, Goodwin. Yeah, yeah. She was caught plagiarizing. She had to pay out a lot of money. Doris, thank you. There was a guy at Emory University who was doing. There was a guy, Ambrose, but Bella Seals, who was concocting evidence about gun ownership because his agenda was, undercutting the Second Amendment, and he was fired. I mean, there are all these other historians that were punished professionally, although Doris Kearns Goodwin is back, talking about presidents, but this is, so what I wanted to do is to say, okay, it's not just that he's left wing, right? You can have any opinion you want, right? But he is violating these rules. He is distorting the evidence. He's twisting around words. He's plagiarizing. But there are advocates of him, and I kind of go into, the efforts to keep his, works out of classrooms, at least public classrooms. But what I was hoping to do is to say, okay, here is the evidence. I don't care what your political views are. If you agree with him, whatever your politics are, but this is illegitimate history. This is not scholarship. It doesn't even rise to the level of, it certainly doesn't rise to the level of being suitable for a classroom.
It doesn't have footnotes. How is it even a history at all?
Well, I mean, textbooks generally don't have footnotes, right?
This is what textbooks are deriving from. This is where they're getting information.
Exactly. And one of the things I point out is, a lot of these books for middle school students have extended quotations from Howard Zinn, and they present him as a legitimate historian. So that as a source, right? It's like paragraphs, and that lures them in. And the Zinn Education Project produces all these prepackaged lessons for teachers. There are spin-off books. It's a whole Zinn industry. The man became wealthy, his estate is wealthy, and as often happens with communists, they get wealthy off of the capitalist system.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I'm just curious, then what has happened with the American Historical Association? You do reference that in the book. I'm just curious if there's any updates there based on the information that you provided about the plagiarism, et cetera. And even at the time when this book was written in 1980, it was panned by editorial boards, if I'm not mistaken.
Oscar Handlin really went after him, and the American Scholar, and I review that. The American Historical Association has become corrupt, like academia. I wrote about this. You may have heard about James Sweet, the president, who wrote on the American Historical Association's website an article about presentism in history. And presentism is, it's something that Zinn wrote about in 1967. He wrote an essay in a volume dedicated to Herbert Marcuse, a member of the Frankfurt School, the Marxists that came here in the 1930s and influenced the 60s generation. And he said, historians really need to leave their ivory towers. They need to leave the dusty archives, and they need to be social change agents. And he talked about some historians who marched in Selma, and he said we should do that. And in our scholarship, we should direct it for change, for social change. But once you do that, as Oscar Handlin pointed out, you have to modify the evidence, right? Yeah, right. And James Sweet criticized the 1619 project, which is the topic of my second book, and he was excoriated for it. I mean, this reminds me of, his apology. I mean, that was worthy of something from Stalinist Russia, groveling and mea culpa, I shouldn't have done that. I mean, he was, here's the 1619 project, another piece of propaganda written by someone who knows nothing, right? And who deliberately lies. And here, the president of the American Historical Association, who is a specialist in the transatlantic slave trade and in Africa, he's apologizing to this woman who really is, in my opinion, very angry and ignorant and arrogant. But it's about the whole state of academia. And so, where are the standards? Yeah.
We only have one Mary Grabar. How do we, many people in this audience who want to counter this false negative narrative about Columbus, what is your recommendation for us? What should we be doing to help the cause?
Well, I hope my book gets out. And one of the things that has, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there is a book by Robert Cohen and a co-author. He teaches at New York University. And he had written this article about Howard Zinn, because I had been, you may remember, in 2020, there was the Conference on American History that President Trump had. I was on that panel, and on the train on my way back, there was like a barrage of, these insulting articles, and he wrote about it. So my statement was about Howard Zinn, how, it turned a generation against America. I mean, that's what it's intended to do. And so I wrote to Robert Cohen, and I never got a reply. And then his book came out, and he mentions me, and he calls me a right-wing something or something, doesn't address what I say. And he mentions one little incident from a colleague. And then he says, but there's no real evidence that Zinn ever plagiarized. I've got pages of proof. So this is what we're dealing with. Now, this book is published by the University of Georgia Press. That's where I got my PhD from. That's a publicly funded press. And it's got the scholarly, imprint on it. And it's directed towards teachers. And here's this New York University professor saying, Mary Grabar is a right-wing activist, I don't know, names I've been called. And there is no evidence that Zinn ever plagiarized. Now you've got these teachers who may have been taught history with Howard Zinn, and they're going to believe him. But what I've been trying to get people to do is to become politically active. And so where public money is being spent, object to it, write letters. I would like the University of Georgia Press to retract that book, because it's just not true. And it's encouraging the use of a book that is based on lies to be taught in classrooms. And I'm not saying that, the founders and Christopher Columbus should be presented as saints. I'm not saying that at all, but they should be acknowledged for the significance to this country, for their accomplishments, and as important people who did important things.
I think we're gonna end on that very perfect note.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm gonna thank everybody for coming and thank you. I
just wanted to thank John Carvelli because it was his influence that helped us to have to come today with both the Columbus Heritage Coalition and the Columbus.
And I want to give one more thanks to NEOF because the books that are all on your chairs that you get to take home with you tonight and hopefully read quickly are all courtesy of NEOF. So I want to give
Thank you,
thanks
John.
for that as well. Very sad about what people can do because it's easy to be in an echo chamber and all agree, but I think the important thing that people can do about any topic that they care about passionately is be present at events. I mean, be vocal. I think one of the things that we just had a very long meeting today about the Columbus Day Parade and participation in that and talking about our own membership of 600 people and the very small percentage of that membership that is out there on Fifth Avenue with us. And so I think, one of the things we want to do, not just about Columbus, but about all things we care about in the city and state and country in which we live, is that if you get involved in things, you can be the best ambassador for any topic. It's when you complacently sit back and go, well, that's really a shame. And then that's when things take off like wildfire. So we all need to have a little bit of activist spirit in us. Thank you again.
Thank you.